Snoop Dogg wasn't new to high society events. He'd been in rooms with billionaires, legends, and Hollywood's elite more times than he could count. But tonight had a different energy. Dressed sharp in a custom-tailored suit, he stepped into the grand ballroom of one of the most exclusive events in Beverly Hills. The chandeliers sparkled, the champagne flowed, and the music hummed like a well-tuned symphony. On the surface, it was all class. But then he felt it. The stares. The whispered comments just low enough to avoid being heard, except Snoop heard everything. He always did. And when one man finally said it out loud, loud enough for the whole table to hear, Snoop had a choice. Walk away? Or remind them exactly who they were dealing with. Snoop Dogg wasn't new to rooms like this. He had dined with moguls, rubbed shoulders with A-list stars, and been the guest of honor at events grander than this one. Still, there was always a difference between being invited and being welcomed. Tonight's event was one of the most exclusive in Beverly Hills, an elite fundraiser attended by Hollywood's most powerful figures, high-ranking executives, and old-money aristocrats who treated wealth like a birthright. The kind of people who sipped champagne with perfect posture and measured their words just enough to hide their real thoughts. Snoop walked in, smooth as ever, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit with a crisp silk tie. His signature shades rested on his nose, adding an extra layer of cool to his already effortless presence. The room was draped in gold and white, chandeliers casting a warm glow over tables lined with the most expensive wines money could buy. A live orchestra played in the background, adding to the event's air of sophistication. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't out of place. But from the moment he stepped inside, he could feel it. The stares. The subtle side eyes. The way certain conversations quieted as he passed. It wasn't about curiosity, it was judgment. And Snoop had been in the game long enough to know exactly what was coming. From the moment Snoop Dogg stepped into the ballroom, he felt the weight of the room pressing against him, not physically, but in the air, in the glances, in the unspoken words hanging between the chandelier light and the murmuring conversations. It wasn't new. It wasn't even surprising. He had walked into places like this before, where power dripped from every corner, where money wasn't just wealth but legacy, where exclusivity wasn't just about who got invited, but about who was quietly excluded. Snoop didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He wasn't one to shrink in spaces like these. He had walked into rooms full of kings, presidents, moguls, and legends. But still, this energy. It was different. It was that old money arrogance. The kind that didn't have to say out loud that you didn't belong, because they expected you to already know. As Snoop made his way across the polished marble floor, he could feel them before he even looked up, the eyes. Some were curious. Some were indifferent. But most carried that barely concealed judgment, like they had already decided what kind of man he was before he even had a chance to introduce himself. The ones with the silver-streaked hair and tailored tuxedos barely acknowledged him, their expressions frozen somewhere between amusement and disapproval. The younger crowd, executives in their early 40s, the next generation of industry power, stole quick glances, whispering to each other, their voices too hushed to hear, but their body language speaking volumes. And then there were the ones who weren't even trying to hide it, the ones whose eyes scanned him up and down, their smirk small but sharp, the kind that said, "Why is he here?" As Snoop made his way toward his table, he caught pieces of hushed conversations. Did they seriously invite him? I thought this was supposed to be exclusive. I mean, I guess he's famous, but this is a different level. I wonder if he even understands the kind of company he's in tonight. Snoop smiled to himself, adjusting his cuffs, letting the words roll off him like raindrops on a windshield. They didn't know him. Not really. They only knew the idea of him, the image, the caricature, the version of Snoop Dogg they had built in their heads from headlines and stereotypes. And he was about to remind them exactly who they were dealing with. As he reached his assigned table, Snoop clocked every face seated around it. Some familiar, some not. To his left, an A-list actor he'd met before, someone who nodded in recognition but quickly turned back to his conversation, not wanting to make it too obvious he respected Snoop. Across from him, two high-ranking music executives who had built their careers off artists like him but still carried that "we made you" attitude. The kind who shook your hand with a smile but whispered about you the second you left the room. And at the head of the table, a man Snoop recognized but had never spoken to, a billionaire media mogul, old money through and through, the type who had never spent a day without privilege, the kind who made decisions about entire industries while sipping 100-year-old scotch. Snoop slid into his seat, his movements slow, unbothered. He poured himself a glass of water, took a sip, and let the silence hang for a moment. He wanted to see who would speak first. The dinner continued. Forks clinked against fine china. Soft laughter floated over glasses of champagne. And Snoop played the game, engaging in conversations, nodding in the right places, exchanging pleasantries. But he could feel it, the tension, the stiffness in the air whenever he spoke. The way certain guests would only offer short responses before turning to someone else, redirecting the conversation as if his words held less weight. He noticed how some would smile just a little too tight, how others would lean slightly away as if he carried an invisible barrier between him and them. It was subtle, but it was there. And Snoop was never one to ignore the signs. It wasn't long before the real test began. One of the younger execs, no older than 40, leaned in with an artificial grin, swirling his drink in his hand. "So, Snoop," he said, his voice smooth but calculated, "do you come to many events like this?" A few heads turned, waiting for the answer. It was a simple question on the surface. But underneath, it carried layers. Do you belong here? Do you know how to act in a room like this? Do you even understand the company you're keeping? Snoop tilted his head slightly, setting down his glass. His smile was slow, deliberate. "I've been in rooms bigger than this one," he said smoothly. "And last time I checked, I ain't never needed an invite to be where I want to be." The man let out a forced chuckle, nodding like he had expected an answer like that. But Snoop could see the shift, the tiny flicker of discomfort in his eyes, the way he straightened his tie slightly, realizing that whatever trap he had tried to set, Snoop had walked right over it like it was nothing. The conversation shifted, but the energy had changed. A few guests were now looking at Snoop differently, some with newfound respect, others with barely concealed irritation. And then, from the head of the table, the media mogul, the man who had barely spoken all night, leaned back in his chair and finally opened his mouth. "You know, it's fascinating," he said, voice slow, measured, the tone of a man used to being the smartest in the room. "I always wonder what it must feel like, coming from, well, your background, and then finding yourself at events like this." Silence. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the line being crossed. Snoop slowly turned his head, lifting his glass to his lips, taking a long sip before setting it down. The mogul smirked slightly, as if he had just played a winning move in a game Snoop hadn't realized he was in. Must be quite the adjustment. And just like that, the room froze. This was the moment. The moment Snoop had felt coming from the second he stepped into the ballroom. The moment someone would say the quiet part out loud. The mogul didn't need to be explicit. His meaning was clear. You don't belong here. You're out of your league. You might be rich, you might be famous, but you'll never be one of us. And now? Now, it was Snoop's turn to speak. And when he did, he made sure they'd never forget it. For the first time that evening, the air at the table changed. Up until this point, the tension had been subtle, a quiet undercurrent of judgment masked by polite smiles and carefully worded small talk. But now the mask had slipped. The media mogul, a man whose name carried weight in every corner of Hollywood, had just made it very clear how he saw Snoop Dogg. Not as a guest, not as an equal, but as an outsider. And he had said it in the way only people like him knew how to: slow, controlled, measured, with just the right amount of condescension to seem casual while still cutting deep. Must be quite the adjustment. The words lingered in the air, thick like cigar smoke, hanging above the table as if waiting to see where they would land. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The waiters, the orchestra playing in the background, the soft clinking of glasses, none of it mattered. All eyes were now on Snoop. Waiting. Snoop leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of his glass. He had seen this play out before. A test. A power move. The mogul hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't insulted him outright. But that was the game, wasn't it? People like this didn't need to say things plainly. They could weaponize a question, lace their words with just enough bite to make you feel it, while still giving themselves a way out. "Oh, I didn't mean anything by it. You're being sensitive. I was just making conversation." Snoop had heard it all before, and he knew exactly how to handle it. Around the table, the reactions varied. Some guests tensed up, suddenly focused on their drinks, pretending they hadn't just witnessed the moment unfold. Others shifted in their seats, clearly entertained, waiting to see how Snoop would respond. A younger executive, no older than 40, smirked slightly, sipping his wine, clearly enjoying the show. The actor sitting across from Snoop shot him a glance, not quite sympathy, but something close. A warning, maybe. A silent way of saying, "You don't have to answer that. Let it slide." But that wasn't Snoop's style. He never let things slide. Especially not when they were meant to put him in his place. Snoop took off his shades. Slowly. Deliberately. He placed them on the table, folding them neatly, his movements precise, controlled. He wanted the mogul to feel this moment. Then, he picked up his glass and took a slow sip, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, easy, dangerous. "You mean what brings me here?" His tone wasn't defensive. It wasn't angry. It was amused. Like he was enjoying this. Like he already knew how this was going to end. And he did. The mogul chuckled, as if trying to brush it off, but there was a slight shift in his expression. He wasn't used to people questioning him. He was used to controlling conversations, guiding the room, making people react his way. But Snoop wasn't reacting. He was watching. Waiting. "I mean, let's be honest," the mogul continued, swirling his drink as if he had all the time in the world. "This event is about class, culture, real influence. No offense, of course, but your world and ours, well, they don't exactly mix, do they?" A few people at the table sucked in a breath. There it was. The line had been drawn. This wasn't subtle anymore. This was a direct challenge. And now? Now, it was Snoop's turn to play. Snoop tilted his head slightly, studying the mogul the way a lion studies prey before it pounces. His smile was slow. Easy. But it wasn't friendly. "That's funny," he said, setting his glass down. "'Cause last I checked, my name carries more influence than half the people in this room." Boom. The impact of the words hit immediately. A few guests at the table exchanged glances. One even chuckled under their breath, quickly hiding it behind their drink. The mogul's smirk faltered. Just slightly. But Snoop saw it. And now? Now he was going to push. "See, the difference between me and you?" Snoop continued, his voice still smooth, still controlled. "I don't gotta pretend I belong here. Y'all spent your whole lives building walls to keep people like me out. But I ain't never needed your permission to walk through the door." Silence. Heavy. Thick. The mogul blinked. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. Because what could he say? Snoop hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown an insult. He had just spoken facts. Undeniable. Unshakable. And the table felt it. Someone chuckled, one of the younger execs. Then another. A few heads nodded, impressed. The balance of power at the table had shifted completely, and now, instead of looking at Snoop like an outsider, they were looking at him like the realest man in the room. Even the mogul, for all his arrogance, knew he had lost this one. He forced a chuckle, raising his glass. "Well said," he muttered. Snoop didn't raise his. Didn't clink his glass. He just leaned back in his chair, put his shades back on, and smirked. Game over. For the rest of the evening, the energy at the table was different. The quiet whispers had stopped. The smirks had faded. Snoop had done what he always did, walked into a room where they thought he didn't belong and made them realize they weren't ready for him. By the time he stepped out of the ballroom, lighting up a cigar on his way to the valet, he already knew. They might not have expected him there, but they'd never forget he was. The room was alive with movement, the clinking of champagne glasses, the hushed murmurs of deals being discussed in corners, the occasional laughter from other tables that had no idea of the shift in energy happening right here, right now. But at this table, at this exact moment, the atmosphere had transformed into something entirely different. The mogul's words still lingered in the air, each syllable dripping with the type of arrogance that came from a life spent believing in his own untouchability, and the idea that certain spaces belonged to certain people. That power wasn't something earned, but something inherited. But Snoop Dogg wasn't here to play by his rules. He had already played the game on his own terms, built an empire without ever needing a seat at their carefully curated table, carved out a legacy so undeniable that even those who whispered about him behind closed doors still played his records at their private parties. And yet, here they were, pretending like his presence was some kind of exception instead of the inevitable result of the world they claimed to control shifting beneath their feet. Snoop didn't react immediately. He let the moment stretch. He let the mogul sit in his own words, let him wonder if he had just won whatever little battle he thought he was fighting. Let the weight of the silence that followed press down just enough to make him feel almost comfortable in his perceived victory. But Snoop had already decided this wasn't going to go the way the mogul expected. Not even close. With the same unbothered ease that had made him a cultural icon, Snoop leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cuffs, moving with the kind of deliberate slowness that let everyone at the table know he was in no rush to respond, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted them to feel the anticipation, to let the weight of what was about to happen settle into their chests before he even said a word. Then, and only then, did he reach up, slide his shades down just a fraction, just enough for the mogul to see the full intensity of his gaze, a look that wasn't angry, wasn't even confrontational, but held the kind of quiet confidence that made men twice his size hesitate before stepping forward. "You mean what brings me here?" Snoop finally said, his voice smooth, steady, like he was tasting the words before giving them away. It wasn't a real question. It was a warning. A signal that the conversation had officially shifted into his hands, that whatever game the mogul had been playing was now over before he even knew it had begun. The mogul chuckled, though there was a noticeable tightness in it now, an edge of something almost imperceptible, uncertainty. He wasn't used to being questioned, wasn't used to people like Snoop pushing back without raising their voices, without showing a hint of aggression, without giving him an obvious fight to win. "I mean, let's be honest," the mogul said, swirling his drink, trying to regain his footing. "This event is about class, culture, real influence. No offense, of course, but your world and ours, well, they don't exactly mix, do they?" And just like that, the room froze. It was one thing to imply someone didn't belong. It was another thing entirely to say it out loud. Around the table, glasses paused mid-air, conversations at nearby tables softened, as if the very energy of the space had shifted to make room for what was about to happen. Some guests avoided eye contact altogether, suddenly invested in the centerpiece arrangements, their plates, their drinks, anything but the tension unfolding in front of them. Others? They leaned in ever so slightly, intrigued, entertained, waiting to see how Snoop would respond. A younger executive, someone who had probably grown up listening to Snoop but would never admit it in a room like this, smirked behind his wine glass, clearly enjoying the way things were playing out. A woman in a midnight blue gown raised an eyebrow, her lips curling at the edges, impressed before the moment had even fully landed. And the mogul? He was still waiting for a response, still sitting in the illusion that he was in control of the moment. But Snoop wasn't going to give him that. He was going to take the moment back. Snoop didn't break eye contact. Didn't flinch. Didn't let even a flicker of irritation show on his face. Instead, he did something far more dangerous. He smiled. A slow, knowing, deliberate smile, the kind that said, "You think you just did something, don't you?" The kind of smile that had made men in the industry sweat in boardrooms, that had left interviewers scrambling for follow-up questions, that had silenced entire rooms without him ever needing to raise his voice. And then, just as the silence became unbearable, just as the mogul shifted ever so slightly in his seat, Snoop finally spoke. "That's funny," he said, tapping his fingers lightly against the table. "'Cause last I checked, my name carries more influence than half the people in this room." The shift was immediate. A quiet chuckle from the other side of the table. A smirk from the younger exec who had been watching closely. The mogul's jaw tightening ever so slightly as he processed the fact that whatever game he thought he was playing had just been flipped upside down. And Snoop? Snoop was just getting started. "See, the difference between me and you?" Snoop continued, his voice still steady, still calm, still carrying that dangerous ease that made it impossible to ignore him. "I don't gotta pretend I belong here. Y'all spent your whole lives building walls to keep people like me out. But I ain't never needed your permission to walk through the door." Silence. Real, tangible, undeniable silence. The kind that doesn't just come from words being spoken, but from the truth in them hitting harder than anyone expected. The mogul, for all his wealth, for all his connections, for all the power he thought he wielded in that moment, had nothing to say. Because what could he say? One by one, the guests at the table reacted in their own way. A slow nod from the actor who had been silent the entire time. A quiet, appreciative sip of wine from a woman who had initially seemed indifferent. Even the mogul, still holding his glass, forced a small chuckle, nodding as if to save face, as if to pretend this exchange had gone exactly as he intended. It hadn't. And everyone knew it. Snoop didn't need to say another word. He had already won. As the conversation around the table slowly resumed, as people adjusted their cuffs and sipped their drinks and pretended like the moment hadn't just happened, Snoop leaned back in his chair, slipping his shades back on with a smirk. Game over. And just like that, the balance of power in the room had shifted. For good. The moment after Snoop Dogg's words landed was unlike any other part of the night. It wasn't just quiet, it was loaded. The kind of silence that stretches across a room not because there's nothing to say, but because nobody wants to be the first to speak. The mogul's smirk had stiffened, his carefully curated confidence suddenly looking like a poorly fitted mask. Around the table, some of the guests darted glances at one another, unsure whether to acknowledge what had just happened or pretend like they hadn't witnessed a man get verbally dismantled in real time. The weight of Snoop's words hung thick in the air, undeniable, unshakable, inescapable. This wasn't just a response, this was a statement. This was a reminder that Snoop wasn't some out-of-place novelty act who had stumbled into their elite world by accident. He wasn't a guest at their table, he was the one deciding who was even worth sitting with him. And every person at that table felt it. The mogul, for all his years of experience in controlling rooms and dictating the energy of a conversation and making people bend without them even realizing it, suddenly found himself in unfamiliar territory. His fingers tightened ever so slightly around the stem of his wine glass, his grip just a little too firm for someone who was supposedly still in control. His eyes flicked toward the younger executives at the table, looking for some kind of silent reassurance, some sign that he still held the upper hand, but all he found was intrigue. Because the younger generation? They weren't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Snoop. And the mogul knew what that meant. A few chairs creaked as people adjusted in their seats, others taking cautious sips of their drinks, hiding smirks behind crystal glasses. One of the younger executives, probably someone who had spent their college years blasting doggy style in their dorm room before slipping into a world of designer suits and calculated career moves, leaned in ever so slightly, his smirk betraying the fact that he had just witnessed something. "Honestly," he said, finally breaking the silence, his voice carrying a newfound lightness, "he's got a point. Who in here hasn't vibed to Snoop at some point?" A ripple of nervous laughter followed, not forced, not obligatory, but real. Genuine. The kind of laughter that signaled that the energy in the room had shifted permanently. Snoop had taken the room without raising his voice, without throwing a punch, without demanding attention. He had simply been himself, and that alone had been more powerful than anything the mogul could have possibly prepared for. The mogul, still holding onto the fragile remains of his control, let out a carefully measured chuckle, the kind that people do when they want to pretend they meant for something to happen. He nodded slowly, as if he were the wise one in the conversation, as if he were allowing this moment to unfold rather than being utterly defeated by it. "Well said," he muttered, lifting his glass slightly. "I suppose influence comes in many forms." But the attempt at salvaging dignity fell flat. Because everyone at the table had already decided that he had lost. And Snoop wasn't even looking at him anymore. As the waiters moved between tables, refilling glasses and clearing plates, something else was happening, something unspoken, but crystal clear. The guests were making a decision, not just about this moment, but about allegiance. The younger execs, the ones who had built their careers worshiping the very culture the mogul had tried to diminish, were subtly leaning toward Snoop, engaging in side conversations that included him rather than the man who had tried to dismiss him. A woman in an emerald green dress, who had previously been quiet throughout the conversation, turned toward Snoop with a smirk. "I have to admit," she said, swirling her glass of champagne, "I'd much rather hear more about your world than sit through another lecture about investments and acquisitions." Laughter. Real laughter. The mogul tensed, but he didn't say a word. Because what could he say? Defeat doesn't always come with a grand gesture. Sometimes, it's in the subtle details, the slight shift in body language, the loss of eye contact, the way people start focusing on someone else, realizing that the real power in the room has already changed hands. And that's exactly what was happening here. The mogul, for all his status, for all his years at the top, for all his connections, had just learned something the hard way. Respect isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. And in this moment, the entire room had decided who had earned theirs. Snoop didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He didn't need to look at the mogul again, didn't need to offer him the dignity of a final exchange. He simply leaned back in his chair, exhaled smoothly, and reached for his glass, sipping slowly, savoring the moment like the finest vintage wine in the room. Because for all the power moves the mogul had tried to play tonight, for all the attempts to remind Snoop of his place, he had ended up proving the opposite. This wasn't his world. It was Snoop's. And now, everyone at that table knew it. The evening continued. The orchestra kept playing. The waiters kept moving. More deals were discussed, more hands were shaken. But no matter how much the mogul tried to act like it was just another night, no matter how many polite smiles he threw at the right people, the energy in the room had changed forever. Because power isn't just about money. It's about presence. And Snoop had just reminded every single person in that room exactly why his presence was bigger than any fortune. By the time Snoop stepped outside, the cool evening air meeting his skin, he already knew how the night would be remembered. Not in headlines, not in gossip columns, but in the subtle shifts that happened behind the scenes. The ones who had dismissed him tonight would think twice before doing it again. The ones who had stayed quiet would remember why staying neutral is just another way of picking a side. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a cigar, and lit it smoothly, watching as the smoke curled into the night sky. Behind him, the ballroom still glittered with wealth and privilege, still hummed with the conversations of people who thought they controlled the world. But Snoop just smiled. Because no matter how elite the event, no matter how expensive the suits, one truth would always remain. You can't outclass real. As Snoop stepped out of the grand ballroom, the night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the murmured conversations of other guests still lingering outside. The energy inside the event had shifted long ago, but out here, Snoop was back in his element, calm, unbothered, and completely in control. A few of the younger executives who had been at his table made their way over, eager to shake his hand, to exchange a few words, to be seen aligning themselves with him now that they had witnessed firsthand where the real power in the room had shifted. One of them, a well-dressed young exec with an expensive watch but an even more expensive desire to be respected, offered a handshake with an easy grin. "Man, that was legendary," he said, half in awe, half in admiration. Snoop just smirked, shaking his hand with a smooth nod. "Nah," he said simply, exhaling smoke from his cigar. "That was just another Tuesday." The exec laughed, but the truth was, Snoop meant every word. Because for him, moments like this weren't extraordinary. They were expected. As the valet pulled up with his car, Snoop took one last glance at the ballroom, at the chandeliers glowing through the massive glass windows, at the mogul inside still trying to salvage the night, still pretending that nothing had shifted. But they both knew the truth. Snoop hadn't just walked into their world tonight. He had redefined it. Because respect isn't something that comes with wealth or legacy, it's something you command through presence, through authenticity, through knowing exactly who you are in any room you step into. And as Snoop pulled away, cigar in hand, music playing low, one thought lingered in his mind with absolute certainty. They'd never forget this night. And they'd never forget him.